Imagine a world where fear and death are your constant companions, where every sip of water could be your last, and the people you trust the most could turn on you in an instant. This was the reality for many during the time of the Black Death, a devastating plague that swept through Europe in the 14th century. The world as people knew it was turned upside down, and the consequences were both horrifying and long-lasting. This essay will explore the human condition after the plague, focusing on the impact it had on Jewish communities, the rise of the flagellants, and the broader social and economic changes that followed. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, first arrived in Europe in 1347. It spread rapidly, killing millions of people and leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. By the time the plague had passed, Europe was a very different place. Entire communities were wiped out, families were torn apart, and the survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. One of the most tragic and disturbing aspects of the plague was the persecution of Jewish communities. Throughout history, Jews had often been scapegoated during times of crisis, and the Black Death was no exception. In many towns and cities, people began to blame the Jews for the outbreak of the disease, accusing them of poisoning the wells and spreading the plague deliberately. These accusations were baseless and fueled by ignorance and fear, but they had deadly consequences. In 1348, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull condemning these accusations and urging Christians to protect the Jews. However, his words fell on deaf ears in many places. In cities like Basel and Strasbourg, entire Jewish communities were rounded up and burned alive. The horror of these events is difficult to comprehend, but it serves as a stark reminder of the depths to which human beings can sink when driven by fear and hatred. The persecution of the Jews was not the only form of violence that erupted during the plague. The flagellants, groups of self-flagellating penitents, emerged as a new and terrifying force. These groups, often numbering in the hundreds, would march from town to town, whipping themselves with iron-tipped scourges and calling for God's mercy. They believed that by inflicting pain on themselves, they could atone for the sins of humanity and persuade God to lift the plague. At first, the flagellants were seen as pious and self-sacrificing. They were welcomed into towns and cities, and people would dip cloths in their blood, believing it to have healing powers. However, as the movement grew, it became more radical and dangerous. The flagellants began to see themselves as the true intercessors with God, challenging the authority of the church and even taking over churches and disrupting services. Worse still, the flagellants turned their wrath on the Jewish communities. In city after city, they would lead mobs to the Jewish quarters, where they would torture and kill the inhabitants. The violence was so extreme that even the Pope, who had initially been hesitant to condemn the flagellants, eventually called for their suppression. By 1350, the movement had largely been quashed, but the damage it had done was irreparable. The social and economic impact of the Black Death was profound. With so many people dead, there was a severe labor shortage, which led to a rise in wages and a decline in the power of the feudal lords. Peasants who had always been at the bottom of the social hierarchy suddenly found themselves in a position of greater leverage. They could demand better working conditions and higher pay, and some even moved into vacant houses and took over abandoned farms. However, the economic changes were not all positive. The shortage of labor also led to a decline in agricultural production, which in turn caused food prices to rise. The poor, who already struggled to make ends meet, were hit the hardest. In some places, the authorities tried to control wages and prices, but these efforts were often met with resistance and even violence. The plague also had a significant impact on the church. For centuries, the church had been the dominant institution in European society, providing not only spiritual guidance, but also social services like education and healthcare. However, the inability of the church to stop the plague or even explain its cause led many people to question its authority. Some turned to alternative forms of spirituality, while others became more secular in their outlook. Despite the horrors of the plague, there were also moments of resilience and solidarity. In some communities, people came together to care for the sick and bury the dead. The bonds of family and friendship were often strengthened by the shared experience of loss and survival. However, these moments of hope were all too rare, and the overall effect of the plague was one of profound disillusionment and despair. In the years following the plague, Europe began to change in more subtle ways. The feudal system, which had been the cornerstone of medieval society, began to break down. The rise of the middle class and the growth of towns and cities challenged the old order. People started to question the social hierarchy and demand more rights and freedoms. The Renaissance, a period of great cultural and intellectual flourishing, was just around the corner. For the Jews, however, the aftermath of the plague was a time of continued hardship and persecution. Many who had fled to Eastern Europe during the pogroms found that they were not welcome in their new homes either. The walls of the ghetto, both physical and metaphorical, became even higher, and Jewish communities were forced to live in greater isolation and fear. The Black Death was a turning point in history, a moment when the old world was swept away and a new one began to take shape. It was a time of great suffering, but also of resilience and change. The human condition after the plague was one of uncertainty and transformation, as people struggled to come to terms with the world they had been left with. In the end, the Black Death serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of human life and the importance of community and empathy. It is a story of both darkness and light, of the worst and the best of human nature. As we reflect on this period, we are reminded that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, there is always the possibility of hope and renewal.